Mao Zedong, 1893–1976, was the founding father of the People's Republic of China and one of the most influential, and controversial, leaders of the 20th century. As chairman of the Chinese Communist Party and head of state from 1949 to 1976, he led the revolution that ended centuries of feudal rule and foreign domination. Revered by some as a national hero and condemned by others as a ruthless dictator, Mao's legacy still shapes China's politics, identity, and global role today. The land reform campaign in China between 1949 and 1953 was one of the most sweeping social and political transformations in modern Chinese history, a movement that not only reshaped the countryside but also cemented the rule of the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong. When the Communists took power in 1949, their most urgent task was to win over the peasantry, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population and had long lived under the domination of landlords and the burden of feudal-style rent and taxes. The CCP had already experimented with redistribution in areas it controlled during the civil war against the Kuomintang, but the victory in 1949 gave Mao the opportunity to implement land reform on a national scale. The 1950 Agrarian Reform Law officially declared that the feudal system of land ownership by landlords should be abolished and the land given to peasants, but what this meant in practice was not just a technical redistribution of property but a radical restructuring of rural society through class struggle, political indoctrination, and at times, large-scale violence. Villages across China were entered by work teams of communist cadres, many of them young urban activists who had little connection with local traditions but carried the ideological zeal of the revolution. Their first step was to classify the rural population into rigid categories: landlords, rich peasants, middle peasants, poor peasants, and landless laborers. This classification was not merely descriptive but determined fate. To be labeled a landlord was often a death sentence, while to be labeled a poor peasant could bring new opportunities, land, and political recognition. The cadres encouraged peasants to recall grievances, to dig up old debts and humiliations, to accuse landlords of exploitation and cruelty. Villagers were organized into meetings where they rehearsed denunciations and prepared for the so-called struggle sessions. These sessions were theatrical, collective, and highly emotional. Landlords and their families were dragged before crowds, denounced, insulted, beaten, and sometimes executed. Such meetings served multiple purposes. They mobilized the poor peasants, legitimized the confiscation of property, and destroyed the authority of the old rural elite. The violence was not incidental but built into the process. The CCP leadership believed that only through struggle could peasants become truly conscious of their class identity, and only through blood could the old order be decisively broken. Estimates of the death toll vary, but most historians agree that between 1 and 2 million people were killed during the campaign, either executed as landlords or driven to suicide by persecution and humiliation. The brutality of the campaign also extended beyond the narrow landlord class. Intellectuals, teachers, religious figures, and anyone with influence in the village could be targeted, as personal vendettas and local disputes often found expression under the cover of class struggle. Yet from the perspective of many poor peasants, the campaign was a moment of empowerment and reversal. For centuries, they had labored under the shadow of landlords. Now, for the first time, they were invited to stand on the stage, denounce their oppressors, and receive land as their own. Millions of families acquired small plots, houses, tools, and livestock. For many, this meant an immediate improvement in living standards and food security. The land reform thus generated genuine enthusiasm among peasants and helped to secure the political legitimacy of the CCP at a critical early stage of its rule. However, the gains were short-lived, because the redistribution fragmented landholdings into very small plots, which limited agricultural productivity and efficiency. By the mid-1950s, Mao and the party had shifted policy toward collectivization, first through mutual aid teams, then cooperatives, and finally the people's communes. The land that had just been distributed to individual households was gradually absorbed into collective farms controlled by the state. Thus, the peasants' brief taste of private land ownership was quickly replaced by collective farming. Beyond the economic consequences, the campaign had enormous cultural and political effects. The destruction of the landlord class meant the destruction of the traditional elite that had mediated local affairs, provided education, and upheld Confucian norms. In their place, the CCP established peasant associations and revolutionary committees loyal to the party, ensuring that every village became an extension of the new state power. Old hierarchies of age, gender, and kinship were undermined, while loyalty to the party became the primary marker of status. The campaign was also a massive exercise in political education. Peasants were drawn into meetings, slogans, rituals, and propaganda, learning to see themselves as part of a nationwide proletarian revolution. The cultural cost was immense. Schools and temples associated with landlords were destroyed, intellectual traditions were disrupted, and countless families were traumatized by the violence. Children of landlords carried the stigma of their class background for decades, facing discrimination in education and employment. Yet the CCP portrayed the campaign as a triumph, a necessary purging of feudalism and a foundation for modernization. Internationally, the campaign was studied by other socialist regimes and became a model for radical land reforms in North Korea, Vietnam, and elsewhere, though it was also condemned by critics who saw it as mass murder. Looking back, the land reform campaign of 1949 to 1953 can be seen as both a liberation and a tragedy. It freed millions from economic bondage, but it did so by unleashing hatred, encouraging violence, and replacing one form of domination with another. It exemplified the dual character of communist revolutions in the 20th century, in which promises of justice and equality were pursued through repression and bloodshed. Its legacy continues to shape China's memory and politics. While the CCP emphasizes the necessity and justice of the reforms, survivor testimonies and historical research reveal the deep scars left on communities. Ultimately, the land reform was a cornerstone of Mao's strategy to consolidate power, and it set the stage for the further radical campaigns of the 1950s and 1960s, including collectivization and the Great Leap Forward. In this sense, it was not just a redistribution of land but a revolution of society itself, a transformation that touched the lives of hundreds of millions of peasants and defined the course of modern China. The Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958 under the leadership of Mao Zedong, stands as one of the most ambitious, catastrophic, and tragic experiments in human history. It was conceived as a radical plan to transform China from an agrarian society into a modern industrial powerhouse within a single decade, bypassing the gradual stages of development that other nations had experienced. Mao and the Chinese Communist Party, inspired by a mixture of revolutionary zeal, ideological fervor, and impatience with what they saw as the slow pace of progress, believed that sheer human will, mass mobilization, and collectivist organization could overcome material limitations. The policies of the Great Leap Forward centered on two interrelated goals: the extreme collectivization of agriculture through the creation of vast people's communes, and the rapid expansion of industry through campaigns such as the mass production of steel in backyard furnaces. In theory, this was to be a bold leap that would allow China to catch up with Britain and surpass the United States in industrial output within 15 years. In practice, it unleashed a cascade of disastrous consequences that culminated in the deadliest famine the world has ever seen, claiming the lives of an estimated 30 to 45 million people. At the heart of the Great Leap Forward was the creation of the People's Communes, massive collective units that amalgamated thousands of households, often encompassing entire villages, into single economic and social entities. Traditional family farming was abolished, land, tools, livestock, and even cooking utensils were confiscated and placed under collective ownership. Communal dining halls were established to replace family kitchens, with the promise that all would share equally in the bounty of the harvest. Private plots were banned, and peasants were organized into work brigades that labored together on large-scale agricultural and infrastructure projects. The goal was to harness economies of scale, eliminate what the party considered wasteful individualism, and maximize production. But in reality, this radical collectivization destroyed incentives for productivity, eroded personal responsibility, and disrupted the intimate knowledge and rhythms of traditional farming that had sustained rural communities for centuries. Crops were often neglected in favor of politically mandated projects such as building reservoirs or producing steel, while peasants lost control over their own survival and became dependent on the commune system. Simultaneously, Mao pushed for rapid industrialization through the infamous campaign of backyard steel furnaces. Convinced that China's strength lay in mobilizing its vast population, the party encouraged millions of peasants to construct small furnaces in their villages, where they were instructed to melt down scrap metal, household tools, and even cooking pots to produce crude steel. The image of peasants tending furnaces day and night was celebrated in propaganda posters as a symbol of revolutionary determination. However, the steel produced was often useless slag, and the diversion of labor away from agriculture at critical times of planting and harvest contributed to food shortages. Moreover, forests were stripped for fuel to feed the furnaces, causing severe environmental damage and further undermining agricultural capacity. The drive for rapid progress created an atmosphere of intense competition among local officials, who were under immense pressure to demonstrate loyalty to Mao by reporting ever higher production figures. Inflated statistics became the norm, with grain output exaggerated several-fold in official reports. These false numbers convinced the central government that China had a surplus of food, leading to excessive procurement of grain for urban areas, industrial workers, and even exports abroad to showcase China's success. Meanwhile, the rural population was left with dwindling supplies. Communal kitchens, initially stocked with food reserves, soon ran out, but cadres continued to requisition grain from starving villages to meet quotas based on the falsified reports. In some cases, local authorities sealed granaries even as peasants starved outside their doors, afraid to reveal the truth lest they be accused of sabotage or disloyalty. The result was a famine of unprecedented scale. Between 1959 and 1962, tens of millions of people perished from starvation and related diseases. The toll was unevenly distributed but nationwide in scope. Entire provinces, particularly Hunan, Anhui, Sichuan, and Gansu, suffered massive losses. Families were torn apart as parents watched their children die, and in some areas, desperate acts of survival, including cannibalism, were reported. Rural communities that had once been resilient in the face of natural disasters found themselves helpless under the rigid structures of the commune system, where traditional coping mechanisms like food storage, market exchange, or migration were prohibited or dismantled. The famine was not merely the result of poor harvests or bad weather, though droughts and floods did play a role. It was overwhelmingly a man-made catastrophe, born of flawed policies, systemic dishonesty, and the suppression of dissent. Political repression compounded the disaster. Those who dared to question the policies of the Great Leap Forward, or who reported the true extent of suffering, were branded as right opportunists or counter-revolutionaries, and often persecuted. One of the most prominent voices of criticism, Defense Minister Peng Dehuai, was purged after he raised concerns about the policies during the Lushan Conference in 1959. His removal sent a chilling message to other leaders, reinforcing a culture of silence and complicity. Fear of punishment ensured that the flow of accurate information to Beijing remained obstructed, prolonging the famine and preventing corrective measures. Mao himself, though aware of problems, was insulated by layers of sycophantic subordinates and ideologically committed cadres who continued to enforce the disastrous policies. The psychological and social impact of the famine was devastating. Traditional values and bonds were shattered as people were forced into desperate competition for survival. Communal kitchens collapsed, families were broken, and trust in the government was deeply eroded, even if public criticism was muted by repression. The famine left scars that lingered for generations, shaping attitudes toward authority, food, and survival in Chinese society. It also marked a turning point in Mao's leadership. Though he retained ultimate power, his prestige suffered, and he temporarily retreated from day-to-day economic management. In the early 1960s, pragmatic leaders such as Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping implemented reforms that dismantled the commune dining halls, restored private plots, and reduced the scale of collectivization, leading to a recovery in agricultural production and alleviation of famine conditions. Nevertheless, the trauma of the Great Leap Forward was never publicly acknowledged during Mao's lifetime, and discussion of the famine remained taboo in China for decades. Internationally, the Great Leap Forward damaged China's reputation even among its socialist allies. The Soviet Union, though initially supportive of China's industrial ambitions, criticized the unrealistic targets and reckless policies. Tensions between Beijing and Moscow deepened during this period, contributing to the eventual Sino-Soviet split. Meanwhile, reports of famine leaked through refugees and foreign observers, though the full scale of the disaster was not widely recognized until much later. The campaign became a cautionary tale of ideological extremism overriding practical considerations, of the dangers of centralized control without accountability, and of the human cost of utopian ambition. Historians continue to debate the precise death toll, with estimates ranging from 30 to 45 million, making it the deadliest famine in recorded history and one of the greatest human-made disasters of the 20th century. The Great Leap Forward thus stands as both a monument to revolutionary ambition and a warning of its perils. It illustrates how policies driven by ideology and enforced through coercion, propaganda, and fear can spiral into catastrophe when disconnected from economic realities and human needs. It also highlights the role of authoritarian systems in amplifying disasters, the suppression of dissent, the manipulation of information, and the punishment of truth-tellers created conditions where mistakes could not be corrected until it was too late. The tragedy of the Great Leap Forward lies not only in the staggering number of deaths but also in the fact that much of the suffering was preventable. Had accurate information been allowed to circulate, had leaders been willing to listen to criticism, and had local autonomy not been destroyed, the famine might have been mitigated or avoided altogether. In retrospect, the Great Leap Forward represents a profound paradox in China's modern history. On the one hand, it was intended as a bold assertion of national independence and revolutionary will, a rejection of gradualism in favor of audacious transformation. On the other hand, it revealed the limits of ideology and the devastating consequences of ignoring economic logic and human realities. It is remembered as a time when optimism turned to despair, when the promise of abundance gave way to mass starvation, and when millions of lives were sacrificed at the altar of political ambition. For China, the Great Leap Forward was both a crucible of suffering and a lesson etched into collective memory, shaping the cautious pragmatism of later reforms under Deng Xiaoping. For the world, it remains a chilling reminder of how quickly utopian dreams can descend into nightmares when unchecked power collides with human vulnerability. The Cultural Revolution, launched by Mao Zedong in 1966 and lasting officially until 1976, was one of the most tumultuous and destructive political campaigns in modern history, a decade-long upheaval that plunged China into chaos, violence, and cultural devastation. At its core, the movement was initiated by Mao as a means of consolidating his waning authority after the disasters of the Great Leap Forward and to reassert the ideological purity of the Communist Revolution. Mao believed that the Communist Party and Chinese society were slipping into revisionism, bureaucratic complacency, and capitalist tendencies, and he called upon the masses, particularly the youth, to rise up, challenge authority, and cleanse the nation of what he deemed bourgeois elements. In doing so, he unleashed a political storm that targeted intellectuals, artists, teachers, officials, and even his own comrades, leading to the persecution, humiliation, imprisonment, and deaths of millions. The movement destroyed not only individuals but also China's cultural heritage, institutions, and social fabric, leaving scars that endure to this day. The initial spark of the Cultural Revolution came when Mao, feeling sidelined by pragmatic leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, sought to reignite revolutionary fervor. He called for the overthrow of the four olds, old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas, arguing that only by sweeping away remnants of the past could China remain on the socialist path. Young people, organized into groups known as the Red Guards, responded with fanatical zeal. Armed with Mao's quotations in the Little Red Book, they marched through cities and villages, denouncing teachers, scholars, officials, and even family members accused of harboring counter-revolutionary thoughts. Schools and universities were shut down as students abandoned classrooms to participate in mass rallies, struggle sessions, and violent campaigns. Intellectuals became primary targets, professors were paraded through streets with dunce caps, beaten in public, and forced to confess to fabricated crimes. Countless books were burned, libraries looted, and cultural relics smashed. Ancient temples, artworks, and historical monuments, some of which had stood for centuries, were destroyed in the frenzy to eradicate feudal traditions. At the political level, Mao used the Cultural Revolution to eliminate rivals within the Communist Party. State leaders such as President Liu Shaoqi and General Secretary Deng Xiaoping were accused of taking the capitalist road. Liu was brutally persecuted, stripped of his positions, imprisoned under harsh conditions, and died in 1969 after years of abuse. Deng was purged and sent into internal exile, though he would later return to lead China after Mao's death. Other high-ranking officials, military leaders, and intellectuals were similarly purged, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion throughout the political system. Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, along with a group of radical allies later known as the Gang of Four, rose to prominence during this period, spearheading campaigns to control literature, theater, and the arts. Revolutionary operas and propaganda plays replaced traditional performances, ensuring that culture served the dictates of politics. The Red Guards, initially encouraged by Mao, soon spiraled out of control. Rival factions formed, each claiming loyalty to Mao but often clashing violently with one another. Cities descended into street battles, with guns, knives, and improvised weapons turning political struggle into civil war. The People's Liberation Army was eventually deployed to restore order, but by then, the damage to society was immense. Millions were displaced as intellectuals and urban professionals were sent to the countryside in the Down to the Countryside movement, where they were expected to learn from peasants and engage in manual labor. While this was intended to bridge the gap between urban and rural life, in practice it was a form of exile that disrupted education, careers, and families. An entire generation of young Chinese, the so-called lost generation, lost critical years of schooling and professional development, leaving long-term consequences for China's intellectual and economic progress. The atmosphere of fear and conformity was pervasive. Neighbors spied on one another, children denounced parents, and personal grievances were settled under the guise of political struggle. Torture, imprisonment, and executions were widespread. Scholars estimate that between 1 and 2 million people may have died as a direct result of the violence and persecution, while tens of millions more suffered imprisonment, exile, or humiliation. The trauma was not only physical but psychological, as trust within communities was shattered and the basic bonds of society eroded. The destruction of cultural heritage was equally devastating. Priceless artifacts, ancient manuscripts, religious sites, and works of art were obliterated in the zeal to purify the nation of its past. In many regions, centuries of history vanished in a matter of months, leaving an irreplaceable void in China's cultural memory. By the early 1970s, the chaos of the Cultural Revolution began to subside, though factional struggles continued. Mao himself remained the ultimate authority, but the excesses of the movement had weakened China's governance and economy. The death of Premier Zhou Enlai in 1976 and Mao's own death later that year marked the end of the Cultural Revolution. Shortly after, the Gang of Four was arrested, symbolically closing the chapter on a decade of turmoil. Deng Xiaoping, rehabilitated once more, rose to power and initiated reforms that steered China toward pragmatic modernization, distancing the nation from the ideological extremism of the Maoist era. The Cultural Revolution's legacy is one of devastation and caution. For 10 years, China endured a near-total breakdown of institutions, education, culture, and trust. It left behind a generation scarred by violence, loss, and interrupted lives, as well as a society that had witnessed the dangers of unchecked authoritarianism and mass political hysteria. While the Communist Party later officially declared the movement a serious mistake, discussion of its full extent remains sensitive within China. For many survivors, the memories of humiliation, suffering, and betrayal remain vivid and painful. Internationally, the Cultural Revolution is remembered as one of the starkest examples of ideological extremism leading to social catastrophe, a reminder of how revolutionary fervor can be weaponized to consolidate power at the expense of a nation's cultural and human capital. In the end, the Cultural Revolution was not only about Mao securing his dominance but also about the attempt to remake Chinese society in a revolutionary image, no matter the cost. It sought to uproot tradition, silence dissent, and create a society of perpetual revolution, but what it achieved was devastation, loss, and division. The decade from 1966 to 1976 stands as a tragic testament to the destructive potential of political fanaticism, leaving behind a fractured legacy of fear, grief, and resilience that continues to shape China's relationship with its own history. Political repression in the People's Republic of China during the Maoist era, and continuing in various forms afterward, was one of the defining features of the communist system, shaping society through fear, discipline, and the systematic elimination of dissent. From the early years after 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party consolidated power, Mao Zedong and his allies made clear that the survival of the revolution depended on strict ideological conformity and the destruction of all potential opposition. This meant not only defeating visible enemies such as former nationalists, landlords, and religious leaders, but also monitoring, disciplining, and punishing anyone whose thoughts or actions deviated from the party line. In practice, political repression was institutionalized through mass campaigns, show trials, purges, and the establishment of a vast network of labor camps known as laogai, or reform through labor camps. Over the decades, millions of Chinese citizens, intellectuals, writers, religious believers, workers, peasants, even party members themselves, were caught in the machinery of political persecution. Many were sent to the camps, where they endured years of forced labor, indoctrination, hunger, and abuse. Others faced public humiliation in struggle sessions, imprisonment without trial, or execution. The cumulative effect was the near-complete silencing of independent thought and the creation of a society in which fear and loyalty to the party defined everyday life. The laogai system was modeled in part on the Soviet Gulag but expanded on an even greater scale in China. Beginning in the early 1950s, soon after the communist victory, the government launched campaigns against counter-revolutionaries, targeting former Kuomintang officials, religious clergy, intellectuals suspected of insufficient loyalty, and anyone associated with bourgeois tendencies. Tens of thousands were executed in public as examples, while many more were sentenced to years in remote labor camps scattered across China's vast interior. These camps served a dual purpose: they punished and reformed those deemed enemies of the people, and at the same time they provided a cheap labor force for the state's industrial and agricultural projects. Prisoners built roads, mined coal, farmed wastelands, and engaged in backbreaking construction projects, all while undergoing relentless political re-education designed to break their spirit and remold their ideology. Survival in these camps depended not only on physical endurance but also on one's ability to demonstrate loyalty, confess to alleged crimes, and parrot party slogans. The repression intensified during successive political movements. In the anti-rightist campaign of 1957, hundreds of thousands of intellectuals who had initially been encouraged to speak out during the "100 Flowers" period suddenly found themselves condemned as rightists. Teachers, scientists, journalists, and artists were accused of harboring counter-revolutionary thoughts simply for suggesting reforms or criticizing party policy. Many were dismissed from their posts, publicly shamed, or sent to the countryside and the laogai for thought reform. This campaign not only destroyed countless lives but also stifled intellectual freedom for generations, instilling a deep sense of caution and self-censorship among China's educated class. During the Great Leap Forward and the famine that followed, political repression ensured that no one could safely voice concerns or reveal the truth about the disastrous consequences of Mao's policies. Local officials, fearful of being branded disloyal, continued to report exaggerated harvest figures and confiscated grain from starving peasants to meet state quotas. Those who attempted to protest or resist were labeled enemies of socialism, often executed or imprisoned. This suppression of truth magnified the famine, contributing directly to the deaths of tens of millions. The culture of fear created by political repression thus played a central role in one of the worst humanitarian disasters in human history. The Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976 elevated political repression to new heights of violence and chaos. Mao's call to purge the party and society of capitalist roaders and bourgeois elements unleashed waves of persecution against intellectuals, artists, teachers, and political rivals. Millions of people were dragged before mass rallies and subjected to struggle sessions, where they were beaten, humiliated, and forced to confess to fabricated crimes. The Red Guards, mostly radicalized students, became instruments of repression, attacking anyone suspected of insufficient revolutionary zeal. Countless individuals were imprisoned, driven to suicide, or killed outright. Families were torn apart as children denounced parents, colleagues turned on one another, and suspicion permeated every aspect of life. At the same time, vast numbers of intellectuals and urban youth were sent to the countryside in the Down to the Countryside campaign, uprooted from their homes and forced into manual labor in remote villages, ostensibly to learn from the peasants but in reality as a form of exile and political control. Political repression during these decades was not limited to high-profile campaigns but embedded into the daily structures of governance. Neighborhood committees monitored households, work units, danwei, controlled employment and social benefits, and political study sessions required citizens to recite party doctrines and criticize themselves. The very language of daily life was saturated with ideology. Failure to conform, even in speech or attitude, could be reported as evidence of disloyalty. Religious practices were banned or heavily restricted, with churches, temples, and mosques destroyed or converted for secular use. Believers who persisted in their faith were persecuted, often imprisoned or executed as counter-revolutionaries. Independent associations or publications were forbidden, only the party-controlled culture, education, and media. The human cost of political repression was staggering. Historians estimate that during the Maoist period, tens of millions of people passed through the Laogai system, with countless deaths from overwork, malnutrition, disease, and abuse. Millions more endured humiliation, exile, or surveillance that destroyed their careers and families. Beyond the physical toll, the psychological scars were immense. Generations of Chinese citizens grew up learning to hide their thoughts, to mistrust neighbors, and to survive by outwardly displaying loyalty regardless of their private feelings. The culture of fear and silence hollowed out civil society, leaving little space for independent initiative or dissent. Even after Mao's death in 1976 and the official end of the Cultural Revolution, the legacy of political repression endured. Under Deng Xiaoping, China shifted toward economic reform and opening, but political dissent remained tightly controlled. The memory of past persecutions reinforced a collective caution. People learned that while markets might be liberalized, political expression would still be dangerous. The violent suppression of the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989 was a stark reminder that the state's intolerance of opposition continued, even if the methods and rhetoric had changed from Mao's time. The system of control evolved, but the principle remained: all independent thought that challenged the supremacy of the party had to be eliminated or silenced. Thus, political repression in China during the Maoist decades and beyond was not simply a policy but the foundation of governance, a method by which the Communist Party ensured its survival and authority. It was enacted through mass campaigns, institutionalized through labor camps, enforced through everyday surveillance, and justified by appeals to ideological purity and revolutionary necessity. It annihilated opposition, eradicated independent thought, and inflicted suffering on millions, while at the same time creating a disciplined, fearful, and politically compliant society. The cost was immeasurable: lives lost, cultures destroyed, talents wasted, and a population conditioned to silence. Political repression ensured the survival of the regime, but at the price of freedom, creativity, and human dignity. The legacy of Mao Zedong remains one of the most contested in modern history, both within China and across the world. To many Chinese, especially those who lived through the early 20th century when the nation was torn apart by warlords, foreign invasion, and humiliation at the hands of imperial powers, Mao is remembered as the founding father of the People's Republic of China, the leader who unified a fractured country and ended centuries of feudal domination. Under his rule, China achieved sovereignty, industrialization began on a vast scale, literacy rates improved dramatically, and the nation re-emerged on the world stage as an independent power no longer subject to colonial exploitation. For these achievements, a segment of the population continues to revere Mao as a symbol of national pride and resilience, a revolutionary figure who lifted China from weakness to strength. Yet this reverence exists alongside a darker and inescapable reality. Mao's political campaigns, including the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, produced human suffering on a scale unmatched in the 20th century. Historians estimate that between 40 and 70 million people perished as a direct or indirect result of famine, purges, forced labor, and political persecution. This staggering toll places Mao in the company of, and arguably beyond, other infamous dictators such as Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin in terms of lives lost under his rule. For critics, Mao's legacy is inseparable from mass violence, authoritarianism, and the destruction of cultural and human capital. Even within China today, the image of Mao divides opinion. Some continue to honor him as a national hero whose portrait still hangs over Tiananmen Square and whose face adorns the nation's currency, while others regard him as the architect of disaster whose pursuit of ideological purity led to one of the greatest humanitarian tragedies in human history. This duality defines Mao's enduring legacy: at once the father of modern China and a tyrant responsible for immense suffering, a leader whose shadow continues to loom over the nation's identity and its debates about history, memory, and the price of revolution.